How should Europe deal with illegal migration?
When people's lives are in danger, you simply cannot just turn them away. I mean, there are humanitarian obligations, and there's also just the question of humanity. However, there's a big difference between that and any notion that countries don't have the right to police their borders or to restrict immigration, and that issue becomes ever more acute when there are perceived cultural differences. And I think that is what we're really talking about at the end of the day.
These people are not always coming because but they're to better their lives. These people are coming or fleeing in order to live. So I think, as the last speaker said, of course, countries have to put some limitations on the amount of people coming in.
Yeah.
The fact that we are responsible because we are very much involved in countries, in Africa, in different countries, in all kinds of relationships that we have with these countries. We, for instance, create the issue. We support dictatorships. And then we don't want the refugees to our countries coming.
So Europe is being punished at home for its overseas policies, Mr. Messiah?
We are not responsible. Under what threshold would we accept billions of migrants under the criteria of humanitarian? Today, we have all over the world billions of people that want to migrate for whatever reason, wars, starving, etc. Europe is not an open continent that can welcome the whole world on its ground.
Europe built itself a very nice house. And a lot of that was because of European industriousness and European ingenuity, but a lot of it was bricks that they brought over from these colonized countries. A lot of Europe's wealth.
And they still are. They still are.
Yeah.
We have oil and gold and all kinds of goods still coming
all of that. So you can talk about an obligation. I think it's a question of degree and not of principle. It's not a question of revenge.
We are not welcoming people who hate us. And
well, that's the real issue. No, hold on. There are a number of.
To come and
we only have a half an hour on the show.
Europe.
There's a number of different kinds of immigration here, and I would suggest we don't get lost in semantics. There are people who are fleeing a war. That's what Sigal is talking about. And yeah, I think even Mr. Zamor would agree that people fleeing a war who would be killed if they stayed home should at least temporarily be allowed in. Then there's people fleeing countries where there's no human rights.
Not billions.
Okay, sure. But then there's a wider group of people fleeing countries where they don't have the same rights as you have in Europe, and they want a better life. And then there's the bigger group of people fleeing economic insecurity, and that is the billions that you're talking about. And at that point, we have the discussion that, if we were being honest, would be the real discussion on the table. Because there are two reasons why countries don't want to accept immigration. One is practical, and that attaches to what happened in Holland. We can't absorb so many at once. Look at the conditions in the camps. Okay? But the other is something else altogether. A desire to preserve their country the way it is, because Holland likes to be Dutch. And it's very easy to say, well, that's racism. And I think if we're being honest, then we have to say that in the imperfect world where we live, yes, most societies are going to be that way. Portugal, I don't think, wants to be overrun by the French. They want to be Portuguese, and it's not racism. It's just standard issue nationalism that seems to govern the way human beings like to organize themselves today. And then it becomes a question of degree. How many refugees, how many migrants even, should Sweden let in before it becomes so un-Swedish that its population itself rebels?
Okay.
It's complicated.
Yeah. Is there a double standard when it comes to Ukrainian and Arab or African migrants in Europe?
There might be difference between both, because we welcome more rapidly and easily what look like us. The more the people look like us, the more we welcome them. The refugees, the Ukrainian refugees, are true refugees. They are families and kids. The African and Maghrebi refugees are mostly men, which are not refugees. They are economic refugees, not fleeing wars or starvation. You know.
We will allow Dan Perry to have his spotlight, and we will open up the conversation. Yeah.
I don't know if I like the look like us, but you know what? Act like us is somewhat more legitimate. Yeah, of course, there's a double standard. I mean, the Ukrainians are, being welcomed more, and you could call that racism, and to a certain extent, undoubtedly, to a degree, it is. But it's also true that it's not unreasonable for European countries to expect a strong degree of cultural affinity on the part of the Ukrainians coming in, and so I think. Not that Europeans are that liberal, all of them, but we're talking essentially about a desire to preserve liberalness.
People coming from Ukraine, they receive more. They're being treated differently. The countries are opening their hands more freely to these migrants. We're having our asylum seekers. I read an article about the same day that a refugee from Sudan came into Europe, and a refugee from Ukraine, and they were treated completely different. The same day, different treatment.
Southern Europe should not bear the full brunt of this. They decided to make a European Union. The responsibility is collective, and whereas I may agree that Greece cannot absorb more, and maybe Italy can't, and maybe France can't, sure. France has over 50% minority population. Maybe they feel that's enough, and maybe that should be accepted. I don't know. But what is for sure, if you look at Europe with a 400+ million people, Europe can be a bit more generous. So my answer to the original question posed on his show is no, you shouldn't have open borders necessarily, but you can be more generous. It won't kill you.
No, we have been very generous the past decades, and now we do not have any additional means to welcome anybody.
Jean Messia, Sigal Kokovivi, Dan Perry, thank you so very much for your time and insight. We appreciate it, and see you soon back on the show. We are out for a 2-minute break and back with more. Don't go anywhere.